Hi YouTube! Welcome to my second video in my series on eating disorders. In my last video, I discussed eating disorders as a maladaptive coping mechanism to deal with stress and trauma. In this video, I will further discuss how eating disorders attempt to cope with the physical manifestations of stress and trauma in particular. The information I'm sharing today is information that I learned during my own eating disorder treatment that I want to pass on to others. So I have some notes here that I'm going to be referencing during this video because I'm going to be sharing some technical information and I want to make sure I get everything correct. Although in this video I'll be discussing how eating disorders are used to cope on a physical level, I want to stress that this maladaptive coping mechanism may seem to help short-term, but actually exacerbates issues long-term. First, I'm going to share a little bit about the long-term effects of stress and trauma physically, and then I'll share about how eating disorders are an attempt to help cope with these physical effects. So long-term stress and trauma gets stored in the body. A useful resource for understanding this is the book The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. In long-term stress and trauma, the nervous system becomes imbalanced. We have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is activated during stress and controls the stress responses, such as fight and flight. The parasympathetic nervous system is activated during safety and controls responses such as rest and digest. In cases of long-term stress, the sympathetic nervous system can become overactivated. So this means that the fight and flight nervous system is engaged more than it should be. Nervous system resiliency is the ability to easily switch between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system fluidly. In long-term stress, the nervous system resiliency decreases. So that means that you can no longer switch as easily from stress into calmness. This means that you can become stuck in fight or flight mode, and it's harder for your body to switch into rest and digest. And this is linked with issues such as anxiety and also depression and dissociation. Feelings of long-term stress and trauma can be extremely physically unpleasant and uncomfortable. Eating disorders can form as a response to this nervous system overactivation and the uncomfortable physical and emotional effects of being stuck in fight and flight mode. Eating disorders and the corresponding malnutrition serves to blunt signals from the physical body. Eating disorders leave a sufferer numb, blunted from emotions and physical sensations. This maladaptive coping mechanism can also happen through restriction of water or sleep. So one way eating disorders serve as a maladaptive coping skill is to promote numbness. And this numbness is no way to live, but it is understandable why this would develop as a means of coping before better means of coping are known. Even though malnutrition may appear to help cope by blunting emotions and physical sensations, it doesn't help overall or long-term. Malnutrition causes more anxiety overall because it activates the sympathetic fight and flight nervous system, leading to further dysregulation. If you think about it, in caveman times, hunger meant you'd have to go hunt or gather. You'd have to activate fight and flight mode to go get food for survival. So hunger from eating disorders activates this too. Conversely, allowing yourself to eat activates the rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system. Eating reduces anxiety on a physiological level. I know this can be difficult with eating disorders because often food and eating have been conditioned to spark anxiety in eating disorders. But if you can push through that initial anxiety of considering eating and eat, then the body's act of digesting the food will trigger the rest and digest, calm, parasympathetic nervous system, and this will cause the anxiety to decrease. Eating disorders also can form after long-term stress and trauma because the sympathetic nervous system overactivation can decrease appetite and make it feel more difficult to consume food. Difficulty with appetite can also lead to the cycles of overeating and undereating, as seen in bulimia or binge eating disorder, because binging is triggered by malnutrition and a previous restriction of food. Eating disorders function to cope with long-term stress and trauma, much in the same way as drug addictions can be used to cope with this. There are also overlaps between eating disorders and other anxiety disorders, such as obsessive compulsive disorder. In eating disorders that involve the restriction of food, starvation releases endorphins. These endorphins make you feel good temporarily and can mitigate feelings of stress short term. In this way, restrictive eating disorders can become addictive because of addiction to this endorphin release. In eating disorders, such as bulimia or binge eating disorder, binging or eating a large amount of food in one sitting causes a release of neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine. In this way, binging can develop as a maladaptive coping skill to deal with stress because it can be used like a drug to produce these feel-good chemicals and can also feel addictive for this reason. Eating disorders have extremely negative short and long-term consequences on both physical and emotional health. They mask stress and trauma and thus cause sufferers to be stuck in it instead of being able to process and release the stress and trauma in a healthy way. Eating disorders disconnect you from yourself. They perpetuate a disconnect from body and emotions and contribute to continued nervous system dysregulation. Eating disorders worsen dissociation, depression, anxiety, and even psychosis, and impede the processing and release of trauma and stress. If you or a loved one is dealing with an eating disorder, I definitely recommend treatment. Recovery is possible and you're worth it. If you have an eating disorder, I know it can be really scary to try to let go of what has been a coping skill. Albeit maladaptive, this coping skill helped you to survive. I want you to know that even though recovery is very scary, it is worth it. You can learn healthier ways of coping with stress and trauma and learn to replace the maladaptive coping skills with healthier ones. I can say that I feel so much better now without an eating disorder. I'm able to connect with myself and life again. And you deserve to be able to connect with yourself and embrace life too. As always, I love hearing from you, so feel free to leave any thoughts down in the comments. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you found this video informative.